Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Caroline Makes Cards. I have a window slider featuring Spellbinders Silent Night Make a Scene. The new Silent Night die set is an add-on for Make a Scene card base. The Make a Scene collection has other add-ons, making this a versatile and easy way to produce beautiful window cards. When open, this 5x7 card has incredible dimension. Slide it closed and it lies flat, perfect for the mail. I started off by ink blending 4 larger pieces of Bristol Smooth cardstock. They were sized around 8.5 by 5.5. This cardstock will be used to die cut all of the components that will go together to construct the window slider. As I apply the ink, I keep in mind that I'm creating a horizon for my scene. I'm working with Distress Oxide inks, old paper, peacock feathers, and faded jeans. I apply many layers of ink, extending one color into the next until I have a nice smooth blend. It takes a little bit of time and effort to work on 4 larger panels like this, but it is worth it. When the window slider goes together, it will have a seamless look. While I have everything out, I apply ink to scraps of Bristol Smooth cardstock that will be used to die cut the elements for this card. All the colors are used again that were in the background, and I add in some seedless preserves and rustic wilderness. I will also make use of some of the scrap pieces after I die cut the large panels. The larger panels are set aside to dry as I don't want to transfer ink onto my dies. We're going to start working with the Make a Card card base. I'm going to deconstruct all the dies that went together to make the sliding panel. The 3 dies that I'm removing create the slots. These will create a small, medium, and large slot that the scene panels will be hinged on. The next 2 dies that I'm removing create perforations on the slider where it will be folded. The final piece that I'm removing is actually a placeholder and not a die at all. Because you will cut 2 sliders, this piece is important because it ensures that the slots are going to match on both sides. I forgot to show you a long, narrow rectangle die that will be used as a guide for the slider. This set also includes a large rectangle which will create the back panel and then a smaller window to be used with it to create the frame. Finally, there are the accessory pieces. These 2 dies will be used to indicate to the recipient that they are to pull the sliders. And then you have an area to put your sentiment, a banner, and a raised area of the banner. So now that you've been introduced to all the dies, we're going to construct the sliding panel. With the slider die cutting side down, a strip of washi tape is going to be placed so that it covers one notch and stretches over covering the other. This will be done on both sides. The die is flipped over so that it is cutting side up and the sticky side of the tape is now exposed. The notches that indicated where we were to place the washi tape are now going to be used to place the dies that create the perforations. The next piece that I'm going to put in is a holder. It is not a die at all. This will guide where the dies go that create the slots. There are 3 of these dies. Each one produces a different size slot. We're going to start with the smallest one centered in the first opening of the holder, and then move to the medium one, and then on to the one that produces the largest slot. The smallest slot die is closest to the T side of the slider die. When the slider is fully constructed, the washi tape will hold everything in place for several cuttings. Okay, so now on to my ink blended panel. The bottom of the slider die is where the slots have the same starting point. I want my horizon to go from lightest to darkest, so the die is placed so that the slots will start off in the light area. The guide piece for the slider won't be exposed at all, but I had room on my ink blended panel, so I die cut it. Now for the second slider. We want to create a mirror image of the first one, so the slot dies need to be rearranged. Each of the dies is flipped around so that the slot is on the other end. To make sure I've got everything right, the die is laid cutting side down beside the die cut. I've got my mirror image, so I go ahead and die cut the ink blended panel. Again, I make sure that the die is oriented so that the starting points of the slots are in the light area of the ink blended panel. The large rectangular die is used to cut 2 pieces of the ink blended cardstock. The frame is going to be constructed from one of these pieces. The smaller rectangular die is placed in the middle. You will notice that on both the large die and the small die that there are some reference points. A ruler is used to line up the reference points both vertically and horizontally for a perfectly centered window opening. A little bit of post-it note tape holds that small die in place so it doesn't shift as it goes through the die cutter. Next, I'm going to use the little word die cut on the pull side of the sliders. As a point of reference, the rectangular die has a center point notch, which I push up against my slider pull, put my die in place, and then hold it with a bit of post-it note tape. The word is die cut on the other slider, making sure that it is oriented so that the top of the word faces outward. Before I go further, all of my panels go into my spatter box. Post-it note tape was used to mask off the pull areas of the sliders. I water down my favorite spatter medium, white gouache. To create a fine spatter, I use a small brush. The smaller the brush, the finer the spatter. The texture of the gouache enhances the snowy night sky. And there are no worries about the Distress Oxide inks bleeding through like it can with other mediums. The half circle die that creates the opening so that the word pull can be seen on the slider is centered on the side of the frame. Again, I use the rectangular die with its reference point to help me center it. Okay, everything is die cut and it's time to put this slider window together. I'm going to start by placing the guides which hold the slider panels in place on the back of the window frame. On either end of the guide there is a score line. This will indicate where to place the adhesive. I'm going to be using small foam squares. When they are adhered, I make sure that the foam square goes above the score line on the top of the guide and below the score line at the bottom of the guide. I am only going to remove the backing paper on the foam square at the top of the guide, line it up along the side of my window, and attach it. The second guide is attached the same way, centered and lined up along the edge of the window. I look at the front side of the frame just to make sure everything is lined up. The bottom of the guides will be adhered later when the sliders are put in place. Each slider has 2 perforated lines that will be used for folding. The first fold, which is closest to the word pull, will be done with the ink blending facing upwards. The second fold is done in the opposite way, with the ink blending folded on top of itself. This creates a Z fold. The second slider is folded in exactly the same way. And there they are, side by side with their Z folds. Strong adhesive is needed for the top of the Z fold at the back of the sliders. This tape will literally hold all the panels together, the top, the sliders, and the back panels. I use a double-sided tape by Sue Kwang when I'm working on an interactive card. Once all the tape is in place, the two sliders are slipped under the guides at the back of the frame. The two sliders meet in the middle and they are aligned to each other. Post-it note holds the panels in place. The backing paper is removed from the foam squares at the bottom of the guides and they are secured. When the backing paper has been removed from the double-sided tape, the panel is ready to be attached. I do one last check just to make sure that everything is aligned. I like to stand up when I attach the back panel so I'm looking straight down at it. I tip the top of the panel forward, line it up with the front of the panel, and then lay down the rest of it. I reach in between the panels to remove the post-it note tape that was used to hold the sliders to the frame. Now that the window slider card base is complete, I can start working with the Silent Night Make a Scene die set. These two dies will create a bracket. The 3 snowy hillside dies are designed to fit within the top bracket to create the layers for the card. The bracket is in 2 pieces so that they can be adjusted for height. So my first layer that's going to sit in the front, I keep the 2 brackets together and then insert the snowy hillside. A little bit of post-it note holds everything together while I die cut it. And my first layer is done. I do have to use my scissors just to snip a little bit where the snow hill meets the bracket. Okay, on to my middle layer. So this one needs to be a little bit taller, and so the brackets need to be spaced. For the last 2 layers, I use the middle and large slot die to help me get the right height. The height of the bracket needs to be a little bit taller than the actual slot in the slot die. So for the next 2 layers, there's a little bit of extra trimming. Not only do I have to make a little snip between the bracket and the hillside to release it, I also have to trim down the outside of the bracket where the height had been increased. 2 layers done and 1 to go. For this last layer, I use the die with the largest slot to guide the height. The top of the bracket needs to be just a little bit higher than the slot. The 3rd hillside die is popped into position. A little bit of post-it note tape and it's ready to die cut. Again, a little snip where the hillside meets the bracket and cut along the bracket's edge where the height has been extended. And so before I get busy building the scene, I'm going to pop all of these brackets in place just to see how it all fits together. So the first couple of brackets that I tried to get into place seemed a little bit cumbersome, but I was popping them in and out the entire time I was scene building and it got very, very simple. So the key is to use the tall part of the bracket, feed it through at an angle on one side, drop the other side down so that you can feed the tall bracket into the other slot. So the biggest thing that I noticed, once the brackets were in place, the whole mechanism was much more stable. And here's the top view so you can really see the dimension of this card. I had ink blended several pieces of Bristol Smooth cardstock so I could die cut all of the little elements out. The Merry Christmas sentiment and Santa's reindeer were die cut from black cardstock. The buildings and the trees, and there were a lot of them, were die cut from all of the ink blended paper. With a blending tool, black soot Distress Oxide ink was applied to the edges of all the die cuts to distress them. I think out of habit I may have tapped the blending tool onto the ink pad. This blending tool is designated for black soot and the pad already has lots of ink on it. I'm pretty sure I could have done all the die cuts without touching that ink pad. I cut strips of yellow cardstock that would be adhered to the back of the buildings. I got a little bit smarter when I was working on the ones for the front of the card, and I cut all the strips on the guillotine, which made this process go a whole lot faster. And yes, all the lights are on in this village. The trees are small, so I put them together in groupings of 2 or 3. I simply put on dots of glue and then use the jewel picker to pick up the trees and get them grouped together. It was a pretty fast process. Some of the smaller trees were adhered to the front of the houses. As I began to assemble my village scene on the snowy banks, I would take the panels, pop them into the interactive card just to check out how everything was looking. I continued in this manner, adding a few elements at a time to each of the snowbanks, putting them back into the window slider, and having a look to make sure that I could see everything. And then I discovered something. My slider would not close. As I was building my scenes, what I did not take into account is that these elements had to fit through the slot. So I had to do some rearranging. I used the dies that created the slots for each of the hillsides to guide me as I made the necessary adjustments. Thankfully, any of the elements that had to be moved, I was able to cover up the blemishes that were left on the cardstock. So here's the other thing that I learned. Thickness matters. I didn't have a lot of layering going on, but what I did have caused a little bit of drag as the panel moved through the slot. I felt it was important to maintain the little bit of layering that I did have to create perspective. So after I finished building my scenes and making all the necessary adjustments, I actually took those panels and ran them through my die cutting machine to flatten them out. And that worked. So now on to the front of the card. I continued to create the village scene on the frame. I first laid out all the houses along the bottom of the frame, and as I adhered them, I would first do some distressing with black soot ink. I worked from side to side on the panel adhering the houses so I could get them evenly spaced out. The little bit of inking that is done around the edges adds to that nighttime feel and really helps those buildings to pop off the card. The banner was also distressed. I had put some Tombow glue on the Merry Christmas sentiment and set it aside to dry until it was tacky. The sentiment was a little bit long for the banner, but I really didn't mind that it hung off the sides just a bit. I was glad that I was using Tombow glue. When it is dry, it is repositionable, and it gave me some flexibility as I worked to curve that sentiment around the banner. The banner had been mounted on a black sheet foam die cut. The added dimension really helps that sentiment to stand out. Before finalizing where the sentiment is going to be placed, I first adhere Santa and his reindeer. This die cut is going to be positioned across the corner of the window opening. For added stability, I make sure that each element is adhered to the frame, even if it's just the tip of the antler. The sentiment on the banner is adhered to the center of the top of the frame. The Silent Night die set is also accompanied by 2 different sizes of snowflakes that were added onto the front panel as accents. And that wraps up this window slider featuring Spellbinders Make a Scene card base and a new add-on, Silent Night Make a Scene. This 5x7 card has incredible dimension and is easily put together. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and as always, I appreciate your visit.